All right. So, who has ever been part of a disaster or a crisis? Anyone been in a disaster zone? Okay, so we don't have any awesome stories. We're going to get to Graham and his stories in a few minutes. What we're going to do today is we're going to sort of define disaster. What are we talking about? And we're going to talk about how to prepare for them. And I'm going to take a couple of approaches. It works for different minds. Go through some step-by-step, some real practical stuff. I've got some things for you to do so you can think about a disaster in your office. And really my goal is to get you interested in going home and developing your own disaster preparedness plan. So here's just some things to think about. When I'm thinking about a crisis, these are the ones I'm thinking of. Car accidents, you lose power in your office. Freak snowstorm. So you have access problems, patients can't get to you. Or there's a big mass casualty situation. How are you ready to handle that? Just pandemic happens. This is definitely not business as usual, right? And we kind of would like to help. We're helpers. But how do we prepare? So I'm going to give you a moment to talk amongst yourself. I was entering a few more people in there. So you're going to pair up. And just answer this question. I'll give you 3 or 4 minutes. Think. What does this have to do with GPs?
This is a question that I posed a few years ago.
The 4 GPs in the back, almost. To tell us, Mark, what did you guys talk about?
We talked about the GP as being a community resource. So when a disaster or crisis may happen, people contacting the GP or contacting the office to get information, whether it be on what to do or how to help with their health or how medications or such.
So big picture questions like what
being a resource and
little minutiae questions. Am I supposed to take my metformin if there's an earthquake or I don't know whatever money question to go?
One of the most challenging things about Hurricane Katrina was not the hurricane, and it was not really the impact. It was the aftercare effects, right? Mm-hmm. A lot of the people that were impacted severely with Katrina wasn't because of the injury from the hurricane. It's because they lost the access to their propranolol, to their metformin, to all of that. And so those chronic diseases became a crisis point. And so could we have done something different?
Yeah.
And that's where a role of the family doc in this could play a huge role.
Yeah, others are came up with your
pandemic planning would be good.
We talked about the big emergencies. Our hospitals are both urban docs, so our hospitals have all these disaster planning days, and how do you call in all the emergency shops, the surgeons, and your acute care nurses, and what's the role of the physician, the community physician, not in the hospital, and the role that we can play, and then just a bit of discussion about we had pandemic planning back in 2007, 2008. Family physicians were much more involved in that, and how would we work alongside with the actual emergency room, given that we're not licensed to be emergency docs, and how we provide that care and the inpatient care and all that stuff on the side of the continuity of medications.
That's good, and I'll give you an example of the role that you can play based on an actual real-life scenario. Because there's a huge role that family docs can play, particularly in saving the hospital. I use that in a term in a major disaster. Everything focused in a big community, or any community, everything focuses on the hospital. So how do you save the hospital? How do you prevent the hospital from becoming overwhelmed? And that's a big role that family doctors will be able to play.
What do you guys talk about?
Yeah, very far.
I think I can crack about administrators, but I'll hold up.
That's right.
And schedule another meeting.
No, he's with divisions. He would get something done.
Oh, no, really good point. Yeah, well, we talked about confusion. How do you get your mind making the plans and making plans make sense?
Confusion, right? No plan.
It's actually execution.
Yeah, one of the things I overheard your group talking about too is that we always focus on the response. Okay? as physicians, healthcare crisis, we focus on response. But we've removed away emergency management. And real quick question, have any of you had any training in your medical school, in your residency at all about emergency management?
A wilderness course?
Yeah, that's the type of thing, because I've asked that question about groups a lot of times, and very few people have, unless they've been trained overseas. So, but in our society, everyone is going to look to you, whether it's a big, small event, pandemic, earthquake, whichever. Everyone looks because almost every disaster involves some aspect of healthcare. It may not be an acute injury, but it may be some of the chronic stuff. So one of the things I overheard this group, we talk about response, how do we respond, what do we do in the response? But response is just one part of the cycle. So after you've had an event, you respond, but then you recover. If it's an earthquake, years and years of recovery time. In New Orleans, the mental health rate, the suicide rate, the depression rate is still above what it was before the hurricane, that many years ago. And who takes care of those patients? Family docs. So you're going to be involved intimately in the recovery part, right? And every recovery is an opportunity to plan for the next one. And we need to be more involved in community planning because the community is going to look to us. So that's the cycle that you were sort of working yourself around.
Just two quick things. One is Graham hasn't formally introduced himself, and I heard last night he's the first physician in Canada to take a master's in.
Ian was saving my spot for later.
Yeah,
so.
Which is fine.
But I think you should. Anyway, the other thing you can take it later on is we're a really small group. You guys have worked hard on this, and however, there are 7 divisions represented, which is actually really exciting. So, and given that technically divisions have 90% of the GPs in the province are members of divisions, this is great.
Yeah, good.
This is great to get asked about.
Good. Right, so primary care is clearly needed by the community in a disaster. The community kind of expects us to be there for them, for information and for helping us respond. And then, of course, no one brought it up, but there's some financial security to doing some planning ahead of time. And this is when we're talking about office disasters, right? So if a water main breaks and you're down for a month, it's a little bit of using a little bit of planning. You can just have your office down for a week or something like that. So there's some financial incentives for doing this sort of thing. Speaking of your office, here's a definition we'll use for the rest of the day. A disaster or a crisis is when your demand exceeds your resources, or demand exceeds supply. We're going to go with resources today. So generally, demand in our case is medical demand, so it's either lots of patients or very sick patients. So acuity goes up or quantity goes up. And you're starting to have a disaster right there, or a crisis. But separately, you could also have the resources go down. So suddenly you don't have any water, or you don't have a hospital, or you don't have power, and now you have a crisis. So 2 ways easily that you can get into a crisis state. Or you can combine them. You have something like an earthquake. Lots of sick people, demand goes up, no resources, double crisis. So that's and this is just another way to look at the same thing. The bottom graph is a bit funny. It's loss of resources. It's not resources going up, it's resources going down. So take something like a hospital explosion, where you've lost your resources. It's not a problem about too many patients. Of course, there would be extra patients because of an explosion, but let's say the hospital just lost its power source for some reason. Then you have lost a lot of resources to curing people, and you're in a disaster state. Now we're going to introduce himself and tell us 2 stories.
Okay, so my name, for those who haven't met, my name is Graham Dodd. My current role is I'm a family doc in
Not for your voice, but for the
Oh, okay. No one's ever accused me of not being able to hear me. Okay. All right, we'll do that for now. So my current role is I'm a family doc in Campus. But in my past, most of my life I started off as a rural doc in Salmon Arm, and that's actually how I became interested in this whole field. And we'll talk about that example a little bit later. Then I spent the next 15, 16 years doing full-time emergency medicine and trauma medicine in Royal Midland Hospital in Campus. And So what I want to give you is a little bit of a flavor, some examples of what this is about. The definition that Ian gave you is key. Because, you know, when you watch TV and you see, you know, the mass shooting in Orlando, you see the plane crash, you see, you know, the earthquake in Japan, and media is very quick about getting pictures out. We automatically go, holy crap, that's a disaster. But what bearing does that have on what we do on a daily basis? So a disaster is, as one colleague said to me, it's just another shitty day in the merge, right? Some colleagues say, yeah, but it always is something that happens somewhere else. So what role do we have as docs in BC? But if you go back to the definition of what a disaster is, it's not about a huge event. It's simply, as Ian pointed out well, when your resources, when the demand is resources. So therefore it becomes relative and scalable. And it can be a simple event in your office, or it can be a big event in your community. So I have 4 examples, and we have 2 now and 2 later. And 2 of the examples I was intimately involved in. 3 of them I've been involved in, and 1 is I haven't been. So let's just I'll get your presentation. Yeah. So I think that's really kind of the key thing from this. So it's scalable, it's relative. Every disaster involves healthcare to some degree. Therefore, every disaster will involve physicians. And outside of a big urban environment, physicians, family docs do everything. So in a rural environment, they involve rural docs, okay? So demand exceeds resources, scalable, it's localizable, it makes sense, it brings it home, okay? So your disaster is when the demand on your local resources is exceeded. So it doesn't whether that's in Parksville, whether that's in Kelowna, Kamloops, whether that's anywhere in the province or in the country. All right. So let's just start simply with your office. Okay. So this is the scenario, and this is my scenario. This was a couple years ago. 10:30 at night, the office manager got a call from the janitorial staff, and so this is a walk-in clinic. There's about 12, 13 docs in the walk-in clinic. We sit below the Great Canadian Superstore. So the janitor said, hey, you know, there's a pipe broke in the office. Called the office manager. The office manager phoned me at home because she couldn't get a hold of the person that headed it, who's in charge of the office, and said, hey, can you go shut off the pipe because there's a pipe leak. So I arrived in February, and in every room, you know, the sort of the drop ceiling, in every room there was water pouring out of every single light source. There's already this much water on the floor. And it was like, So there is no pipe to shut off. Right? You know, and you look around this sort of thing, and you know, so basically what happened, a big pipe broke in the store above, it floated through the walls, down through the underground parking that they had, and into our clinic. Okay? Everything is flooded. Every single room, the reception, the waiting room, all the exam rooms, okay, were flooded. Who do you call? What are your next steps? Okay? Who do you notify? Like, ahead of time. Okay? We ended up being closed for a month, our clinic. So if there are 12 docs, 5 staff. So they're out of work from that clinic. We see about 80 patients a day in the clinic. So 2,400 patients staff. Where did they go? Well, the majority of them went to the emerge because there's nowhere else to go. So for that month, 2,400 people couldn't be served. So what did we learn? Well, one of the challenges is that we had a relatively new office manager at the time, and the doc that had set up the clinic had moved. So we really never thought about this before. Which insurance did we have? I don't know. So I'm sitting in the office. Who do you call? I don't know. Phone the office manager. We have insurance. Who do we call? We have to figure out where the insurance papers are, which are already wet, right? To figure out who do we call. And then once we called them, they told us who to call. But that took like an hour. Meanwhile, I'm sitting here watching the water come down, right? Trying to shuffle little paper boxes around, right? So that was a challenge, right? We had how long is our office going to be closed for? Everyone wanted to know right away how long you need to be closed. We didn't even know what damage had been done. And where was the plan for this? Was there a plan? The flood relief people came in fairly quickly and basically they determined that everything that's below waist-high walls were soaked. They all had to be torn out. Okay. So the lesson for this was you know, when we, in this room, that we talk about patient networks, and some of you might have been here for that, but what relationships do we have with the other clinics? These patients that we saw in our clinic, many of them were unattached. Where else could they be seen? What about the docs in the clinic? Could they work somewhere else? Maybe could we extend hours somewhere else and cover those patients? What about the staff? How are they going to be paid? Ultimately, it was paid through insurance, but before we sorted that out, we had to reassure the staff that we were going to take care of their wages. Right? We could have done a better job talking to our other family docs in the community because we sell a lot of their patients too, saying, could you increase your capacity somehow and manage your own patients? Right? How do we get the information out to the media? You know, and we needed to have a better knowledge of who, what, where, and how to call. So one of the ways, which we didn't have, and Ian's going to talk about, because this is one of the exciting projects that the Victoria Division came up with, was building a business continuity plan. Because every business has one, but most physician offices don't, and yet we're businesses. So that was the big learning point that came out of that. Okay, so a simple office flood, nothing major, nothing horrible, but the patient demands exceeded the resources we could provide. Okay. Second scenario, a little bit bigger, right? You guys remember the mill explosion in Burns Lake? Was that a disaster? Some people will say no, it wasn't. There you go, right? That's the exact thing. So some people say, well, it's not a disaster, it was just a mill, right? But think about the definition, okay? The resources exceeded the demand. So Burns Lake is a pretty small little town in northern BC, about a population of about 2,000 people, okay? One little hospital, there, okay? 3 docs, 1 on at night, 1 nurse, basically, an emerge kind of thing, probably in the hospital, quite frankly, right? So mill explosion, 5 patients critically injured, 15 other people injured, all arrived at the hospital at the same time, okay? Because this was just down the street, all right? So, you know, these were all burn patients, all severely injured patients. They all had to have transfers arranged. Many of them had to be intubated, okay? So who do you call, right? And then transfers that night, patients went to Prince George, Vancouver, Edmonton, Vancouver, and Victoria, all right? So was it a disaster? Absolutely. So think about it. You're the rural doc in your community, right? So you're just, hey, I'm on call tonight. And they're usually not very busy. And this happens. So you're the only doc there. Or you were called in by a colleague. You're sitting at home playing video games with your kid, right? And you get this phone call. What do you do? Right? We all want to help because that's what we do, right? So you have to treat them. You have to arrange the transfer of those patients, right? It's also a very small community, so there's a very good chance that those patients are actually patients of yours. That those families affected are actually patients of yours. This is your community. You know everybody in this community, right? So that affects you on a different level, right? And you're going to have to manage both the immediate effects of this, but also the long-term effects of this, right? Dealing with the injuries from those patients that come back to the community, dealing with the post-traumatic stress component that comes from those family members. So as a family doc in that small community, you're going to need to be involved in all of that, right? And I can guarantee you probably that some of the effects of that explosion in 2012 still exist today. So, does your small hospital have an emergency disaster plan? So big hospitals, right, emergency docs can take care of it, but in your small hospital, you're in. Do you know what the plan is? Do you know where the plan is? Were you ever involved in the plan? Do you even have a plan? How do you activate it, and what's your role to it? Okay? And do you have the support systems in your community then to manage the recovery that could go on for months or years afterwards? So disasters are relative. So if this had occurred in Vancouver, just put it in perspective, right? What did you come up with?
My table? What did you, so don't give me your plan, give me your sort of like gestalt. It was like, oh, that process was...
Well, it was interesting to think about because at my clinic in particular, we really don't have a plan in place, so I could see if this happened without being prepared, we'd be kind of running around, you know, like chickens with our heads cut off. So I think it's important to know, you know, if we need to shut off the gas, the water, electricity, where it is. So having maybe a map or having some kind of document, assigning roles, especially if you're in maybe a bigger clinic, on what somebody's responsibility will be. And again, maybe trying to look at how can we save the hospital, and with a clinic be more of a triage for some people who are less injured. So being a resource for the community.
Okay, perfect. This table, gestalt of the process.
Well, I think we were fired, first of all. And
Sorry to hear that.
we realized that, at least at our office, we depend heavily on an office manager who seems to know everything and they know nothing.
Okay.
And we're on the second floor. We don't have an escape route for disabled people.
Right. Or the slow.
Or slow mobility issues. Yeah, so I think there's a few issues that we would have to look into that
Yeah.
we don't have planned at all.
Yeah. It doesn't really take much. You just have to stop and think about it and be like, oh, okay, someone's going to do this, this, and this. And then you've thought about it. And then if it suddenly happens, people sort of fall into place a bit more. Any other comments?
And we just also talked about having like some sort of muster station outside so we gather.
Good, yeah, we talked about that.
Safe, but after we've actually had someone assigned to check the rooms and make sure we haven't left patients in stirrups. That sort of thing. 'Cause they're in there.
That's true, that's true, that's right. They're just waiting patiently.
Are empty, and then a muster station outside so we can track everybody.
Okay.
And then the importance of probably having our contact information, not just in a nice binder in the office, that this is the insurance company.
Yeah.
This is our disaster restoration people, but happens to be on a phone or number of phones.
Exactly, yes. Yeah, yeah, perfect. This team? Team D?
We were extreme planners. And we talked a bit about contacts as well, that something as simple as getting in touch with other people, if you don't have the contact information at home, you're out of luck. So
So,
start talking to people and addressing issues.
right, storing it on the cloud is sort of how we describe it in the handbook.
And one of the other things, remember, in communicating is, let's say you're in the office, or let's say there's a fire, right? You can be both the responder and the victim. So in other words, you may be intimately involved in the operation, the response, but your family's worried about you, right? Or vice versa. Big weather event that occurs, is your family safe? And if you don't know that, you rapidly start to dysfunction, and you become useless as a provider. So it's balancing that, it's connecting those.
Yeah, 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 got to worry about. Document some things. All right, so then let's go back out to the big disaster and back to our definition, demand exceeds your resources. So the demand is many injured people can show up, so a plane crash, bus crash, mill explosion, now you are in a crisis situation. You have lots of resources, but demand exceeds them because you just barely usually have enough resources for the day-to-day stuff. Or the demand's fine and you lose something important for your community, the whole hospital or electricity or internet or something like that. Or you can no longer have transportation because there was the freak snowstorm. So it turns out that in these big events, disasters around the world, the best way to help people medically is to get the primary system up and running again. That's the big takeaway. Because the hospital can't manage. All the hospitals around the world are barely coping with day-to-day stuff. And so when they have less resources and more demand, they just stop. And it's the primary care system, if it can chug back to life and start taking care of these people, then it releases the pressure on the hospital and they can start to function a lot faster. Practice continuity. So when you think big, you actually have to think small. How am I going to solve this giant community disaster? I need to have individual offices ready to get back up, to rebound quickly, and get some sort of communication system going on. So another way to look at the big disaster scenario is think of, all right, so what are we going to do right when it happens? Well, as Graham just pointed out, so now we're in the thinking of how to respond phase. What you do is you make sure your family and friends are okay, and then you treat the acutely injured as you can. And then you have to get to the chronic response, so you call that the recovery, but this is sort of the transition between response and recovery. You basically have to learn how to do primary care in this new environment of less resources. So in Christchurch, when they had their big disaster, they had a building, they had doctors and nurses and power, but they had no running water. So they were all ready to see patients, but they couldn't wash their hands and they couldn't go to the bathroom. So the clinic would grind to a halt until they were able to communicate to the municipality. You need to bring water and some porta potties in, and we can function. That was sort of the lesson for them. And then they had to learn to live with this sort of heightened emotional state that goes on and on and on and on. And the next thing is I'm going to show a video of a pharmacist, and he's got a really thick New Zealand accent, so you have to listen very carefully. And he's just he's the best person I've heard describe what it's like to be working post-disaster.
It was all new to us, so we just had to kind of be ready, but things just changed day by day. I had staff saying, if there's an earthquake, which door do we go out? If that door's got something blocking it, maybe you go out that door. And they're asking the basic sort of questions. But they just wanted some guidance. And it wasn't just for work things either. Some people obviously struggling at home. And every staff member we've got about 25, I think it's in a different scenario. And so some were upset, some were just wanting to be here and help and get through. Others were scared for their kids, scared for grandparents, parents. There's no right and wrong answer. You just have to assess every situation and let people go if you need to.
So just the way he explains that, sort of like, oh, I had a real penny drop moment when I watched that. It's all about the recovery. Like, sure, we can all sort of get past the first 24 hours, but the months that go on afterwards, where everyone's just not themselves, that's the hard bit. And that's certainly not a hospital is going to help with that. No, that's primary care. Any comments on that? Does that seem to resonate with you? So that's a way of looking at the big community response. And really the way to do that well is communication, is to figure out how are we going to get the resources where we need, where we've lost resources, and how are we going to distribute this demand, and how are we going to know where our resources are, and how are we going to communicate the new plan, because the first plan went out the window because we didn't plan for this. So that's the fundamentals besides keeping your practice going that you want to do that. Over to you for Stuart's. Unless there's some personal stories in the audience.
I'm going to give you two more examples, and remember the thing about Christchurch, we'll talk about that. Because I find that fascinating for a number of reasons, because my family lives in Christchurch. So, wildfire. Those in the interior, this is our summer, right? This, every summer we sort of live, is this the next one, right? So this is Fort McMurray. But I want to go back in time, and I'm going to go back to Salmon Arm in 1998, and it's salient for a bunch of reasons. One, I was in this community in 1998. The event that occurred here is what got me into disaster medicine and emergency management, and 10 years later led me back to doing a master's degree in this field. So here you are in Salmon Arm. You're the family doc. Again, this is a rural community, right? So you're the family doc in the emergency department. Happened to be in the office at that time, but you're in charge of the emergency department. Wildfire that had been blowing on the hills for a week or two, suddenly decided it was going to move rapidly down into town because of the windstorm. The community and the hospital were suddenly at risk and declared at risk
from an encroaching wildfire. And in fact, the fire line was actually behind the hospital. So, 3 o'clock in the afternoon, what are we going to do? We need to evacuate the hospital. And you, Dr. Dodd, you're in the emergency department, you're in charge. You need to evacuate the hospital, 50 patients, and about 200 long-term care patients in the care home next to us. There is no plan for this, and certainly in those days. There was no plan. There's a plan if there's a fire in a waste paper basket, but not if there's a fire outside the hospital. So how do you do this? And calling colleagues around the province in Alberta, and they all said the same thing. Sounds interesting. Let us know how you do, and then we'll figure it out ourselves. So you've got to figure this out. You've got to act on the fly, right? So it goes back to now we're thinking about the importance of planning and being involved. What are you going to do, okay? So, at the same time, as the hospital is being evacuated, 2/3 of the community is being evacuated as well. So about 10,000 people are being evacuated from the community at the same time. We all remember the fires a couple of years later in Kelowna, but this set the stage a few years before that. So while I'm trying to evacuate the hospital, my house is being evacuated, right? So it goes back to communication. Can I get a hold of what's happening in my house? Try phoning on the cell phone. Can't get through on the cell phone. Can't get through on the landline. I got to the point where I was absolutely dysfunctional, and I finally had to say, I've got to go home for 10 minutes, find out what's happening, right? So you can be both the responder and the victim at the same time. Once the hospital is evacuated, for the next 10 days, the hospital remained evacuated. The interesting thing about that was basically all the physician family docs offices in town were closed because they had been evacuated. A number of those family docs left town. A number of our specialists left town, not for any malicious reason other than, well, what else am I going to do? Right? So forced holiday. So off they went. We still kept the hospital, we still kept the emergency department open because there were still people in the community, right? And we became the community clinic. So how do you function in a hospital that's not a hospital? And every patient that needs to be admitted automatically meets a transfer. And the key to it all was communication with the neighboring hospitals down the valley, with Enderby, Vernon, Kelowna, Kamloops, right? And so it became, who staffs the hospital? Who staffs the emergency department? How do we arrange those sorts of things? And those other facilities were phenomenal, right? Yeah, absolutely. Just let us know what we can do, right? Hey, I've got this patient I think needs to be admitted. No worries, we'll take care of them. Just send them to us. Do you want to know what's wrong with them? Don't worry about it. Just send them. So it was phenomenal, okay? So creating a plan, right? Afterwards, we made some mistakes. One of the big mistakes we made after the fire was that we just, it's all done, good. We had a chance to make a plan, but we didn't. Because we're just so happy to be back to normal, and as docs, your busy office, you're picking up, right? You don't have any background in this field, so why do we need to make a plan? It's over. So we could have, and over time it became quickly forgotten and overlooked, etc., and reminisced now in stories. But remember, the small town hospital, as a family doc, you're the physician lead, you're the medical lead, your patients look towards you, your community looks towards you, okay? You're the medical resource, right? And at that time, we were one of the few hospitals in Canada to have been evacuated. So fortunately, other hospitals have now been evacuated, so we're getting a much better idea, and there are plans that exist, right? And you probably have plans in your hospital, you just might not know where they are. But if you're the family doc in that hospital, you'll have a role in it. So just another thing to be thinking about preparation, right? And so the final scenario is the big city shake, right? And a lot of this province lives in that sort of earthquake vulnerable thing. This is the last 30 days of earthquakes in BC as of the middle of June. So there's not one, there's a whole bunch, right? The chance of having a major earthquake in the lower mainland of the Vancouver Island over the next 50 years is about 30%. It's not small, right? May never happen, but the risk is there, okay? So if we've never had something like this, who can we learn from and what can we do, right? Who can we learn from? And Ian's point was exactly the one, Christchurch. So Christchurch is a city in New Zealand. It's about the same size as Victoria. It's the largest city on the South Island of New Zealand. It is also the major trauma center and the major referral hospital, okay? So what did we learn from their earthquake? The hospital was overwhelmed. At the same time they were responding, they were also evacuating parts of the hospital because they lost power, water, etc., right? They had 266 patients presented in the first 3 hours to the emergency department. No ambulances arrived for the first hour, yet 133 patients came. Many of them critically injured, okay? So what is the role? So this is the emerge docs place to play. This is the surgeon's place to play. What role in a big city does the family doc have to play? So one of the interesting things and this is what's so exciting about divisions. Divisions came from New Zealand. And so one of the things that the Canterbury division is they formed, and you may have noticed on Ian's video, the graphic that said the Canterbury Primary Response Group. So this is a group of family docs who then during the pandemic realized, hey, we have a big role to play. And so they linked in pharmacists, family docs, allied healthcare workers, and they met and they developed plans of how they would respond. They became an actual integral part of the district health board, which is the health authorities, plans, hospitals, community public health, primary care. So they had a huge role to play in the earthquake, as Ian mentioned, okay? So their basic role was to save the hospital and to take care of patients outside of the hospital. They managed during the acute phase many of the minor injuries, so they didn't have to go to the hospital. Ambulances actually brought patients to those clinics that were identified. And the division, in this case in New Zealand, played a big role in coordinating all of that. Then they played a huge role in recovery and building those support structures, because that's still occurring. My family lives in Christchurch. I have my dad's cousin, etc., still live there. You know, they're still not back in their home 5 years later. In fact, they're not even sure if the neighborhood's going to be rebuilt yet. Downtown Christchurch, businesses are still in metal box containers. Okay, so this will go on for a long time. And again, the burden on mental health and on chronic disease from this still is occurring. So you have a big role to play in protecting your hospital and therefore protecting your community. You know, how prepared are we? Well, the bottom line is we're getting better at this, but remember, a lot of the emergency management professionals have no experience in clinical. A lot of the clinical folks have no experience in emergency management. So it's kind of a gap, right? And you know, as Ian mentioned, our hospitals are already overwhelmed. There's no room for this. And a lot of times when you talk to hospitals about planning, they say, you know what, we'll deal with it when we're less busy. So there's a gap, right? And so we have a big role to play as community docs to protect our patients, protect our families, protect our hospitals. And it starts in your individual office, in your groups of offices, in your communities of offices, and in your larger community as a whole. Okay?
We have the Medical Access in a System Crisis Program. It's got two parts to it. So we worked with the municipalities, got them in the room along with the health authority and the Ministry of Health, and we came up with a plan about how GPs will integrate, and I'm going to show you the plan in just a sec. And then we established a central communication hub for all the GPs to call into, and then for the municipalities to also connect with, so we know what the GPs need. And this place they're calling is actually in the hospital, where the hospital is managing the whole island's worth of disasters, or managing any response on the island. All right, so this is our what to do in a disaster if you're a GP. So pretty small to read, hopefully. So it says, there's been a major event, so this is you, a GP, reading this, or you've been contacted by this thing called PDOC, which I'll explain. The first thing you need to assess after you do all the things we talked about, taking care of your family and stuff like that, is there communications? If yes, you're going to contact that central communication place. But if the communications are out, this is how you act on your own to take good care of your community. You figure out, am I a family doctor who works in an office? Am I a family doctor who works as a locum or a GP specialist? Or am I a family doctor who's a hospitalist or does surgical assists? And then, if you're a GP who works in the office, you say, is my office safe? And if yes, try and see patients, if you can get it operational. And if no, and we do try and teach you how to assess your office as best we can, go to the nearest office and start seeing patients if you can. So that's a great thing that you would want to set up beforehand, a little bit of a neighborhood support group with all the GPs in your geographic area to say, hey, if there's a big disaster, is it okay if we share offices until things get sorted out? And then if you can't find any office that needs your help, then go to the reception areas, which will be broadcast by the radio stations. And that's what the municipality is setting up for injured people and just people without homes. So those are your instructions for if you're a GP without an office and if you're a locum GP. And then if you typically work at the hospital, then go to the hospital. And then everyone needs to call this thing called the PDOC, which is our central communication line. So it's, you can email, you can phone us, you can text us. And we're busy. That's supposed to say PDOC, the words. So what it's doing is the GP has needs, but it also has abilities. I can see patients. Tell the PDOC, and we're going to tell the hospital, and we're going to tell the municipalities, and we're going to tell the province what's available and how to get patients where GPs can serve them. And then the other way around, GP needs something, more bandages, more porta potties, feed that to the PDOC, who then goes and asks the community municipalities and the federal and provincial government where to put those resources to help serve the public. So PDOC sits down here. The health authority has an EOC, an emergency response center. They're actually co-located, and then those guys have all the communication channels to the rest of the provincial disaster response thing. So we're tied in quite tightly, which works out well if you're going to be a central point of communication. Comox Valley has also done some work in this area. They've taken a different approach. They started out by setting up disaster first aid stations. So they said, we're going to designate places in our community that we want patients to go to. And they taught them how to triage. They taught them how to do rapid damage assessments. And they're working with all their municipal partners to set up how that's all going to work together.
So these first aid stations are actually clinics?
Yeah, existing clinics.
Existing clinics.
Southwood Medical Clinic, Valley Care Medical, Comox Medical Clinic, and they're working on sort of a business continuity plan for them too. So very similar. All right.
And they're identified by a sign.
A big sign that
they have in their clinic.
Yeah. Okay, so now the moment where you think, all right, Graham and Ian have talked and talked and talked and talked. What am I going to do when I leave this room? So what can you do for your community? Well, it kind of starts with making sure your family's going to be safe and you've got water and supplies at your home so you can feel comfortable that you could survive some time if there's a big disaster that happened and your family would be safe. So that's number one. The other number one is start to work on business resiliency, because that's the foundation of all small disasters all the way up to the big disasters, is to have your office ready to go. And you also have to practice a plan. You can't just have a plan, you have to practice it. And then start considering making practice support neighborhood connections with other offices, because it would really help in the event that you have the water main break. Then you can go and talk to your colleagues and maybe see a couple of the super acute patients, or you really need to see in their clinic if they have a room, or Fridays they always have a spare spot. Then you've sort of established that relationship. And vice versa, of course, if they have a big disaster, they can come work in your clinic. And then think bigger. So think your home, think your office, think your geographic community of GPs, and then think health authority and community disaster plan stuff. And we're in a unique position, it turns out. No one's really paying attention to this area. They kind of think everyone else is doing it. So Divisions is a great organization to make those kind of things happen, because it's just a small amount of organizing and you get this huge result of calmness and quicker recovery.
It's not just family docs. If you ask the church docs too, they all think someone else is planning this as well.
Yeah.
So that's even more frightening than big centers, right? So if someone's planning this, they'll just let us know what to do. But they're the key point. They're the focal point. This is a family conference. We want to talk to the doc.
Yeah, they feel, you know how our patients are attached to us. They want to talk to us. They don't really trust anyone else. It's very sweet. So here's a few resources. We've given you the guidebook and the handbook, so that's a great place to get started. You've got some journal articles I signed you up for.
If anybody wants information, I have
Yeah.
more than enough to point people in the right direction.
Victoria,
Send those to us, we can send them out.
let's do a sign-up sheet. Did
Good. I mean,
do we have a little sign-up sheet?
I'll look through. I mean, I have hundreds of them, so I have to figure out which ones are going to be most practical for us. It's a starting point. I know you don't want to.
I have a sign-up sheet out by my, my booth that I have a little stand there about disaster preparedness. So there's a sheet right there. If you could write down your email address, I'll send you things, or you can contact me. Maybe we could develop our own little practice community around this, and Graham and I will support all of the 7 divisions that are represented here. Alfredo Tura is the Comox connection, and he's got a resident doing a presentation on his preparedness that he's doing in his community. We can help you get lists of emergency kits and their costs and descriptions, and as I mentioned, a community of practice.
And there are some multinational resources too. The Canadian Centre for Emergency Preparedness, which is out of McMaster, is actually creating an online community of practice, and one of the areas they're adding to it is family docs, rural and family docs. So it may act as another resource. Once that gets up and going, then that can be distributed around the world. So bigger community.
Good. We're all done. Thank you very much.